something today about universities as unsafe places for young men. 2 years ago, the 7:30 report featured a shamefaced male UNSW student confessing he'd been involved in boys' night out activities where they chanted appalling songs which were now being denounced by the feminists. The feminists claimed they glorified rape. Listen to the lyrics of these songs. I wish that all the ladies were buns in the oven, and if I was a baker, I'd cream them by the dozen. Sure, they're sort of bawdy and lusty, but they're also typical drinking songs, the type of sort of vulgar sexual dissing that's been part of our culture since well before Chaucer's time. I vividly remember girls in my daughter's school romping through a performance of Canterbury Tales, which included numerous mentions of willies and spillies. Even funnier was one of the lyrics condemned by the feminists on the 7:30 report, I'd like to tickle their clitoris. They said this was part of rape culture. On the contrary, isn't this exactly what we women have been asking for? I spent 10 years early in my career teaching Australian men to find the clitoris. And I think we should be celebrating the fact that tickling it is now on their agenda. It may all seem like a joke, but this is actually all deadly serious, because some male students have been thrown out of college for singing such songs. In our universities now, young men have a target on their heads because a noisy, small group of feminist activists is determined to prescribe appropriate behaviour between men and women and is shutting down any sign of lusty, normal male sexual activity. And the men in power, the mainly male vice-chancellors and administrators who run our universities are so desperate to win brownie points from the feminists that they're willing to sell young men out. We're seeing across Australia universities run by people who are more interested in virtue signalling than providing fair treatment for all. And that's a disgrace. What's equally disgraceful is the fact that we have all been cowered into allowing our universities to become unsafe places for young men. For the last 8 months, I've been involved in helping a young man, a PhD student at Adelaide University, who was accused of sexual assault by a fellow student. And he contacted me to say he was being investigated by a university committee for what could be, of course, a criminal law matter. What a fiasco. It was clear from the beginning this committee had no idea what they were doing. They sent him emails demanding that he attend meetings with the committee. I got a criminal barrister to help him, to help advise him, and he told the guy not to go into any of these meetings and to demand full details of the accusation. It was pretty scary because the PhD student had been told that the committee had the right to withhold his PhD if he didn't cooperate. All of a sudden, so we had all these emails back and forth, and then all of a sudden the university's general counsel stepped in and immediately backpedaled, assuring my guy that he too should be awarded procedural fairness and offered him support services, and that they got him a full statement of what the accused was saying, but also gave him the proper legal advice that he didn't have to respond. He had no obligation legally to respond. And of course, as is often the case in these situations, her version of events was rather different from his. She claimed that he'd been pursuing her, but his social media messages showed that she was often the instigator of the interaction between them, including inviting him over on the night in question. And the whole business came to an end when the university decided they were dropping the case. And he was given his PhD and very happily left the university. I've published a YouTube video talking to this guy about his really harrowing ordeal. I suggest every one of you young men should have a look at that. It's very scary. Now, the real issue is not what happened in that bedroom, but why on earth Adelaide University chose to get involved in the messy business of determining which story to believe in a date rape case involving 2 students. It's notoriously difficult to know the truth in these he says, she says sexual consent cases, where young men are rarely convicted on such crimes. If you put that sort of sexual consent case before a jury, most juries won't convict a young man if they don't know who to believe. And that drives the feminists crazy. They're absolutely determined to get more rape convictions in sexual consent cases, and that's why they're cajoling the universities to get involved in the business of investigating and trying young men for sexual assault cases. They want more young men convicted. And that's what led to the fake rape crisis on our campus. Last year, I'm sure you've noticed, the Human Rights Commission, Australian Human Rights Commission, spent $1 million of taxpayers' money trying to prove there was a rape crisis on our campuses. And they came up with virtually nothing. They found 8.8% of students reported being sexually assaulted last year, or that particular year. I mean, of course, any sexual assault is one too many. This is a serious crime. This is a criminal offence for very good reason. But those cases, that 0.8%, included girls travelling to and from uni on the train, bus or whatever, involving someone who wasn't even a student. They used the broadest possible net, and all they came up with was 0.8%. What they mainly found was a lot of unwanted staring. Males looking at females in a way that women didn't like, or telling sexual jokes or making comments. Now this was an enormous blow for the feminists who'd been spent years beating up this idea that there's a rape crisis on our campuses. We had screenings across Australia of a so-called documentary called The Hunting Ground, which promotes the idea that, it's an American movie, it promotes the idea that campuses are crawling with rapists who are preying on female students. That propaganda movie has been denounced across America. 11 Harvard University professors have said it's biased propaganda for distorting. There were a couple of key cases that they talked about, key rape cases, which were ultimately, where the young men concerned were ultimately found not guilty for a grand jury. So the Harvard Law professors objected to the fact that they were still presented as rapists in this movie. And there was misleading statistics. It was a deliberate attempt to misrepresent what was going on campuses. And the filmmakers themselves said, yes, this was a propaganda movie. They saw no need to present both sides of the issue. And amazingly, our ultimate virtue signalling Vice Chancellor, Michael Spence from Sydney Uni, was on a committee promoting this propaganda movie across the country. So interestingly, after the Human Rights Commission data was released, everyone still pretended there'd been a rape crisis. They pretended the data showed that. Talk about the emperor's new clothes. It was really very funny. I was the only mainstream journalist that day to publish an article celebrating our safe universities. I wrote to, one of the things I've done is got the UNSW, the New South Wales Bureau of Crime Statistics to produce data comparing universities to the rest of the country. And in New South Wales, universities are 100 times safer place for young women to be in terms of sexual assault than the rest of the community. Anyway, so I wrote to all our vice chancellors saying, what are you doing? Why, our cash-strapped universities, and they're trying to frighten off students, families of potential students in Asia or China, India, you name it, trying to convince them that Australian universities are not safe places for young women. And all the media units of the various universities across the country ran around trying to come up with weasel words to tell me, oh no, it's just about ensuring our universities are safe places for young women. And it was just an extraordinary performance. And of course, most of our mainstream media absolutely conspired to ignore the statistics and beat up the rape. This idea of there still being a problem on our campuses. 7:30 report featured 2 alleged victims of rape, 2 women who were so drunk, they said that quite openly they'd been so drunk, totally pissed, went off to the boys' room, they didn't know what they were doing. But of course the feminist argument, the feminist position is that all sexual activity involving an intoxicated woman inevitably means it is sexual assault because she can't give consent. So the 7:30 report presents these cases as sexual assault. fascinating thing. Last year, the University of Canberra had a party safe page on their website, which said things like, if you're drunk or using drugs, you're more likely to do things you wouldn't normally do when you're sober. And of course, the feminists came in and said they weren't allowed to say that. You're not allowed to say, don't get raped. We're only allowed to focus now on don't rape. All the emphasis is on male responsibility, and we're never allowed to give any advice to women about how to look after themselves. And of course, the University of Canberra caved in and removed that page from their website. Don't get raped is conspicuous by its absence from the whole the endless university virtue signaling activities that followed the release of the Human Rights Commission data. And all our universities, it's just been extraordinary to see. They've introduced sexual assault units on campuses. They've set up these committees, like the one at Adelaide. The one at UTS is even more hilarious. They've got students on the committee investigating these potential criminal matters. I mean, what a hell of a responsibility is that? And then there are all these, have you heard about the sexual consent courses? We have compulsory sexual consent courses in universities across the country, which put the responsibility for sexual assault squarely on the shoulders of young men. It's up to a young man to decipher a woman's messages regarding consent. There's absolutely no responsibility on her to know her own mind or give clear messages. The man has to seek enthusiastic consent every inch of the way. And even then he can change his mind and claim she can change her mind afterwards and claim he raped her. Women have always a right to change their mind and redefine what's happened to them. Back in the 1980s, I was a guest producer on Four Corners, much to the outrage of all the traditional ABC supporters. And the program we made was called Yes, No, Maybe. It was all about sexual consent, and it was at a time when there was huge campaigns going on saying no always means no. And I went out and interviewed lots of women about this and had no trouble at all finding women who were willing to be interviewed saying that no doesn't always mean no. Sometimes they deliberately drink so that they can obliterate themselves and get carried away and don't have to take responsibility for making a decision about whether they really want to have a sexual relationship with this guy. Or they admitted to playing games where they said no and then they hoped he'd push through their resistance. Any of you who've read the bodice ripper, romance novels that are hugely popular with women, that's one of the major themes. You succumb, you literally say no, and you play hard to get, and then he pushes through that resistance. So no doesn't always mean no, but of course it should. We should be teaching women to clearly say no when they don't want to have intercourse, when they don't want to have sexual interaction with a guy. But there is none of that in these sexual consent courses. I sort of see it rather like women are treated rather like a pot plant on a gardening show, where the man has to work out whether the plant is dying and you put your fingers in your chest to see whether the water is dry and examine the leaves. I mean, she's like an inert object that the man has to try to interpret and decipher. Nothing whatsoever is required of her in terms of clearly indicating consent. And what's really weird about this is we don't do this in other aspects of women's lives. An 18-year-old woman who gets pissed and goes out and gets behind a car and kills a pedestrian is culpable. She is regarded as responsible for her actions. How is it that only when it comes to sexual activity she has no responsibility whatsoever when it comes to exposing herself to sexual harm? And of course we have no hesitation in telling men they have to be responsible if they when it comes to taking advantage of a drunk woman, and as we should, I think that's totally reasonable. But we won't hold back from telling a man he's really stupid if he parks his Porsche and leaves it unlocked in the middle of Redfern, or he leaves a wallet on the bar somewhere. We expect men to be responsible for putting themselves in harm's way. Judges aren't even allowed to comment anymore on girls who get totally pissed, half-dressed, going to a nightclub in the middle of the night. There was a judge the other day in Britain who made a very carefully worded comment suggesting this wasn't a brilliant idea, that a girl had done that and she got sexually assaulted. And of course all the feminists descended on her and ripped her apart. But of course I'm sure most people reading that thought it was a perfectly sensible thing for the judge to say. We are silencing all debate on this issue. And what's fascinating about those sexual consent courses is this whole passive woman idea simply doesn't work. There was some interesting research published a few years ago in the New England Journal of Medicine. It was called The Efficacy of the Sexual Assault Resistance Program for University Women. And it was written by a Canadian psychologist called Charlene Sen, who's done a lot of work on this, and she says most of the programs that are being used, like the programs that are being used in Australia on sexual consent, have never been formally evaluated and have not been proved to be effective. And what Sen and her colleagues have worked on is a resistance program. Yes, we teach men not to rape, that's understood, but we also need to teach women about looking after themselves. And her programs teach women to recognise dangerous situations and resist sexual coercion. And she finds much more dramatic effects if you use both those approaches. What was fascinating to me is I talked to a lot of our drug and alcohol people, our experts in Australia, and they say if we wanted to do something about sexual assault on campus, the first thing we do is talk about the drinking culture and drugs as well, but mainly drinking, and that's what leads a lot of young people into trouble. And there's good research from overseas showing this link between sexual assault on university campuses and the amount of drinking going on, but our experts aren't even allowed to talk about it, let alone do research on it. Now we know where this whole dangerous business of universities investigating sexual assault is heading. As our lily-livered vice chancellors know all too well, universities in America have already gone down this road and it's proved a disaster. Do you know about the Columbia mattress girl? Columbia University mattress girl. Fascinating story. Back in 2015, the mattress girl, who's called Emma Sulkovitz, became a global celebrity by turning what proved to be a fake rape allegation into performance art, because she carried her mattress everywhere with her on campus for nearly 3 years. And she was protesting Columbia Uni's decision not to take action against a young male student, Paul Nussgesser, who she'd accused of choking and anally raping her. Now, the university investigated the case and found him not guilty. There's a Facebook message from Sulkovitz to Nussgesser 2 days after the alleged rape, saying she was really keen to join a party in his room. A month later, she was seeking more contact. I want to see you, she said. Following month, she messaged, I love you, Paul, where are you? The university decided this young man wasn't guilty, and yet they allowed Sulkovitz for 3 years to carry her mattress around campus and hold protests where he was openly named as her rapist. They regarded this performance art as a contribution to her visual arts major and gave her credit for that. And they allowed her to take her mattress with her to her graduation ceremony. Now, Nussgesser and his family have taken a big court case, taken action against Columbia, and the university has apparently paid out big time in a confidential settlement for failing to protect him from defamation and harassment. Funnily enough, just after the Columbia verdict was handed down, we had protests at Parliament House in Canberra because it's just when the Human Rights Commission data was about to be released, and the protesters were all out there carrying their mattresses, these alleged rape victims. No, I thought that was pretty funny, really. So across America now, universities are being sued for their failure to offer basic legal protections for young men who are accused of such crimes on their campuses. And this has all come about because Obama required all publicly funded universities to set up tribunals across the country to investigate sexual assault cases, and using totally different standards of proof that are required in criminal law cases, not giving men any of the basic legal protections they have under the law. They weren't allowed to see lawyers. There was one young man who was locked up for 3 days somewhere in a room on campus and not allowed to see anybody. Extraordinary stories. If you want to read about this, there's a really good book called The Campus Rape Frenzy, which has been tracking all those cases. And there's been endless federal court cases taken against the universities. And so far, the majority of cases have gone against the universities, 53 cases to 37, and there are huge numbers more in the pipeline. Trump is now winding back this tribunal system, and the universities are on their knees dealing with the massive costs of all this. How is it possible our universities don't know what's happening there? Of course they know. And they're still too scared to stand up to this tiny group of feminists, bullying them into going down the same road. Isn't that just extraordinary? Look at what's happening in Britain. Britain's been rocked recently by the collapse of a series of rape cases where it turned out that prosecutors were deliberately withholding evidence, key evidence, that might have helped the accused. And the former director of public prosecutions recently stepped down. All current serious rape and sexual assault cases are currently being reviewed. And listen to this, the Metropolitan Police are now ditching their practice of believing all victims. That's long been part of the feminist push for victim-centred justice. We have to believe all victims, and that's what the public prosecutors were doing. So they were withholding evidence that would have allowed these young men off, and it turned out that the evidence which was eventually being revealed allowed some key cases to be acquitted. And it's regarded as a total outrage that the British police and the British prosecutors were kowtowing to this feminist push for victim-centred justice. Feminists have long argued that social media messages should be withheld from rape trials. So it's all about tilting the law to get more rape victims, and that's exactly, to get more rape convictions. And that's exactly what the feminists want to happen here. The New South Wales Law Reform Commission has just been asked to examine if enthusiastic consent can be included as part of the state's rape laws. And across the country, rape laws are being changed to deny the accused normal protections under the law. And the main targets are young men. You young men are at risk. It really worries me how easy it is for a woman to make an allegation against a man with no evidence whatsoever. What we're having, particularly in Sydney now, is they're targeting the college. The fake rape crisis turned out to be a huge disappointment. They didn't get very far with that. So they're having to dig up new statistics, and all this work is being done surveying people in colleges. They're focusing on the colleges now because they have a better chance of bullying them into being involved in all this activity of investigating sexual assault. And of course, I'm sure you've heard about attempts to take down St Paul's here in Sydney. The media is promoting allegations that date back 40 years that have already been thoroughly investigated and disproved, and yet the media continues to promote these. There was a woman found on St Paul's campus 40 years ago. Police investigated thoroughly. She had nothing to do with the university. She wasn't a student. The rape the rape and murder had nothing to do with the university whatsoever. But that's always mentioned in this whole battle to take on St Paul's. Now, I'm not saying that young men can't be really stupid. They promote and post vile stuff on Facebook, and they can get involved in some really offensive behaviour, and we have to call that out. And perpetrators need to be reprimanded. I don't think there's any question about that. But now, any display of lusty male sexual behaviour can get a man into trouble. In my Adelaide case, what he alleged, we don't know what happened in that bedroom, as I said, but he alleges what happened is they never had intercourse, they were groping, a lot of sex play. At a certain point she said she didn't want to go any further. She claims he went on longer than she wanted him to. He claims he stopped as soon as it was clear to him that she didn't want to go ahead, because she told him she'd fallen in love with someone else the previous week. And he claims he got dressed, went home and defriended her, on all the Facebook and everything. And he believes that made her really angry. And that's what led to this rape accusation. We don't know the truth about that, but what we do know is women often do really hideous things when a man dumps them. We know all about a woman's scorn. We've seen women cutting up the man's clothes, horrible, horrible things. And rape allegations can be now in there as part of the armoury for a scorned woman. And this is pretty scary stuff because we're allowing the most anti-male members of our community to define what is normal sexual interaction between men and women and control our behaviour. Why are we doing that? The anti-male problem on our universities isn't just about sex. How come we now have 60% female graduates and still the feminists are bleating about getting more women into the tiny remaining areas where women don't totally dominate, like engineering? Just as boys are the ones doing really badly in schools, they're filling the remedial classes, they're dropping out, so too it's young men who are much more likely to drop out of uni, and no one gives a damn. Nothing has been done to address that. I found a paper the other day, a newspaper article where an academic dared to say maybe we should have a look at that, and of course he was howled down. But the campaign to get more rape convictions is what's really scary to me, and I think we have to speak out before our universities head further down the path to what's led to so many young men's lives being derailed in America. As I keep saying, the feminists who are driving all this are a tiny vocal minority. And if we all stood up, the rest of the community stood up and was willing to be counted, we could give the universities the courage to stand up to them and ignore their nonsense. So I hope you're going to come on board my campaign to challenge this anti-male bias in our universities and elsewhere. I'm working full-time now on trying to draw attention to the demonisation of men in our society, which is impacting on so many different aspects of males' lives. There's a good reason why we have 7 people killing themselves in Australia every day, and 5 of them are men. And our suicide prevention people have, for years and years and years, even resisted acknowledging that it's a particularly male problem. And they still won't do any research on why so many men are killing themselves. So I hope you're going to have a look at my YouTube channel. I've been a YouTube vlogger for the last year, which is very exciting for me. I had a lovely interview last year with Jordan Peterson, and I'm excited now when I go somewhere and have young men come up to me and say, "I watch your videos," which is great. So I hope you'll have a look at them and support my videos and read. I've got lots of articles about everything I've been talking about today on my website. And if you'd like to help me, if you'd like to come on board, I have a whole team of volunteers who are now working on some of the issues I'm concerned with. So I'd love to hear from you. Now, I've got any questions?
No time for questions.
No time for questions. Really? Oh, sorry.
Sorry.
You have to ask me questions in the break. Thank you very much.